beneath the southern districts of Tehran, at a depth that the Iranian Aerospace Force had publicly described as sufficient to survive any conventional munition in any adversary's inventory, the Islamic Republic of Iran had spent 11 years constructing what its own commanders called the Arsenal of the Revolution. It was not a single facility. It was a network, a series of interconnected tunnels and chambers carved into the bedrock beneath the city's industrial southern belt, accessible through entry points disguised as warehouse complexes and light manufacturing facilities, linked by rail corridors wide enough to move assembled ballistic missiles on their transporters, ventilated by systems that exhausted through industrial stacks, indistinguishable from the surrounding factories. The network's deepest chambers sat at a level that had been engineered to survive the yield of any penetrating munition for which an accurate public specification existed. The operative word was public. The intelligence collection effort that produced the targeting package for what the Combined Air Operations Center would designate as Strike Package November had begun 22 months before the first weapon released. It drew on signals intelligence from collection platforms operating in the electromagnetic spectrum above Tehran, on imagery analysis from satellites whose orbital paths had been adjusted specifically to maximize coverage of the southern industrial district, on the product of human intelligence sources, whose identities and methods will not be discussed in any document that exists outside the compartmented vaults of the agencies that ran them, and on a geophysical survey conducted by an asset, the existence of which the United States government has not acknowledged and will not acknowledge within any classification level that this analysis can reach. The geophysical survey was the key. The network's engineers had made the decision that depth was their primary defense, that sufficient rock and concrete above the facility would defeat any weapon, and that the construction resources required to achieve that depth were more valuable than any other investment in the network's survival. They were correct in their assessment of every weapon for which accurate specifications existed in the open literature. They had not had access to the specifications that did not exist in the open literature, and the geophysical survey had provided the targeting team with something the Iranian engineers had not known they needed to defend against: a precise three-dimensional map of the network's layout, its connection points, its ventilation corridors, its structural weak nodes, and the specific chambers where the production equipment for the Shahab and Kheibar Shekan ballistic missile programs was concentrated. The targeting team had spent 4 months converting the geophysical map into an aiming solution. The strike package that resulted was not a single weapon against a single aim point. It was a sequenced, multi-axis, time-on-target architecture involving assets from 3 separate force elements whose coordination required a level of joint planning that the Combined Air Operations Center at Al Udeid had been building toward since the 3rd day of the conflict, when the intelligence staff had first briefed the operational command on the existence and contents of the geophysical survey. At 2 a.m. on March 13, 2026, the strike package was released. The first element was a flight of B-2, a Spirit aircraft operating from a forward staging location whose designation does not appear in this analysis. The B-2s carried GBU-57A/B Massive Ordnance Penetrator munitions configured for the sequenced defeat architecture that had been validated against the Fordo facility 2 days earlier. 3-weapon sequential release against each designated aim point, timed to exploit the fracture zones created by preceding detonations. The aim points for the B-2 element were the 3 deepest chambers of the network, the production halls where the missile guidance system integration was conducted, the propellant mixing and loading facilities, and the chamber that the geophysical survey had identified as the network's primary structural keystone. the point at which 4 separate tunnel corridors converged, whose defeat would isolate the western production section from the eastern storage section and prevent the coordinated reconstitution of production capacity, even if individual chambers survived. The second element was a package of Israeli Air Force F-35I Adirs aircraft carrying GBU-58 bunker-busting munitions against the network's shallower northern section. The corridors and transfer halls that sat at depths the GBU-28 could reliably defeat, and whose function, in the network's operational architecture, was the movement and staging of completed missiles for transporter loading. The F-35Is were approaching from the northwest, on a flight profile that had been coordinated with the B-2 element's timing down to the second. Their weapons would reach the northern section 31 seconds after the B-2's first detonations in the deep chambers, at the precise moment when the structural shock of the deep detonations would be propagating upward through the rock and creating a seismic condition in the northern corridors that would amplify the penetrating munitions effect. The third element was not airborne. It was already in the ground. In the months preceding the strike, a series of precision Tomahawk land attack missiles had been fired against the surface facilities above the network's entry points, the warehouses, the loading docks, the administrative buildings, in strikes that had been conducted under a cover rationale of targeting what CENTCOM publicly described as IRGC logistics infrastructure. The strikes had been real. The rationale had been accurate but incomplete. The secondary purpose of those surface strikes had been to collapse the entry points and emergency egress routes that the network's personnel would use to evacuate when the deep strike began, to seal the access corridors from above at the moment when the people inside the network would most need to use them. The Tomahawk strikes against these positions were timed to execute 12 minutes before the B-2's weapons reached their aim points. 12 minutes was not enough time to evacuate a deep underground facility. It was enough time to confirm to anyone inside that evacuation was no longer an option, which produced a specific effect on the communications traffic emanating from the network in the interval between the surface strikes and the deep detonations, an effect that the signals intelligence platforms orbiting above Tehran captured in full, and that the analysts at the National Security Agency's watch floor in Fort Meade were reading in real time as the B-2 element was on final approach. The B-2s released their first weapons at 2 a.m. The aircraft were not detected by the remnants of Iranian air defense radar coverage that remained operational in the Tehran area. The degradation of Iran's integrated air defense system over the preceding 14 days of strikes had not been total. Individual radar systems and surface-to-air missile batteries remained operational, some of them in configurations that suggested deliberate concealment and preservation rather than damage. But the specific corridor through which the B-2 element approached had been identified by the electronic intelligence collection as a gap in the remaining coverage, a corridor of relative radar blindness created by the interaction of terrain masking and the gaps left by the destruction of the primary early warning radars in the first days of the conflict. The first GBU-57, released by the Lead B-2, struck its designated aim point at 2:18 a.m. The seismic event that followed was recorded by monitoring stations across a radius of 300 kilometers. The Iranian National Seismological Network, which had been configured to distinguish natural seismic activity from underground nuclear testing, recorded a sequence of events over the following 8 minutes that its automated systems initially classified as a magnitude 3.4 earthquake with unusual harmonic content, before the manual review that followed reclassified the events as consistent with large-scale underground detonations at depths between 40 and 90 meters. The reclassification took 11 minutes. By the time it was complete, The B-2 element had released its full weapon complement and was aggressing to the northwest. The Israeli F-35I released their GBU-58 at 2:49 a.m., exactly 31 seconds after the first B-2 detonation, as the sequencing required. The GBU-28 struck the northern corridor section across a 4-second window, their impacts creating a line of penetrating detonations along the corridor axis that the structural analysis predicted would produce progressive collapse of the tunnel ceiling across a section length sufficient to permanently disrupt the movement function of that portion of the network. The prediction was based on the geophysical survey's characterization of the rock composition in the northern section, which was softer and more fractured than the deeper sections and therefore more susceptible to the propagating failure mode that sequential detonations along a linear axis produce in undermined rock. The prediction was accurate. At 2:04 a.m., 4 minutes into the engagement, the signal's intelligence collection registered a change in the communications traffic from the network that the analysts described as cessation rather than reduction. Not a decrease in the volume of transmissions, but an absence of them. The silence of a communications node that has stopped transmitting because the transmitters are no longer functional, or the personnel operating them are no longer able to do so. The silence was not complete. One emergency frequency continued to transmit intermittently for 11 minutes after the cessation of the primary communications, a single low-power signal that the direction-finding systems placed at the eastern edge of the network's footprint, in the section that the structural analysis predicted was most likely to retain partial integrity after the strike sequence. The signal was encoded. Its content was not decrypted before it stopped at 2:15 a.m. After 2:15 a.m., the communications traffic from the underground network beneath southern Tehran was silent. The Iranian Aerospace Forces' response was delayed and dispersed. The surviving air defense elements in the Tehran area transmitted activation signals at 2:02 a.m., 2 minutes into the strike sequence, a response time that reflected the disruption of the command network that the previous 14 days of strikes had produced, and that was too late to generate intercept geometry against the B-2 element, or the F-35Is, both of which were already past the engagement point of any interceptor that could have been scrambled in the time available. 3 surface-to-air missiles were fired into the southwestern approaches to Tehran between 2:03 and 2:07 a.m. on pre-planned search bearings. None generated a target track. All 3 flew until their fuel was exhausted. The desperation response came at 2:19 a.m., 4 minutes after the network's communications went silent. The Iranian Aerospace Force launched a salvo of Kheibar Shekan medium-range ballistic missiles from a mobile launcher that had been positioned in the mountains south of Tehran, a pre-positioned asset that had been held in reserve specifically for this contingency, maintained at immediate launch readiness for 14 days against the possibility that the production facility would be targeted and a retaliatory strike would need to be executable before the launch infrastructure itself was located and eliminated. The missiles were targeted at the USS Gerald R. Ford carrier strike group operating in the northern Arabian Sea. The salvo was 4 missiles. The Ford's strike group had been tracking the mobile launcher since its activation signals appeared at 2:14 a.m., tracking it with the cooperative engagement capability network that linked the carrier, her escorts, and the Aegis Ashore facility in Romania into a single integrated air picture. The SM-3 Block 2A interceptors assigned to the ballistic missile defense mission had been loaded in the Ford's escorts since the beginning of the conflict. The engagement solutions had been pre-computed against the launcher's position. when the 4 missiles rose from the mountains south of Tehran at 2:19 a.m. The intercept sequence was executing within 14 seconds of first track. The first 3 missiles were intercepted at altitude over the central Iranian plateau. The 4th missile executed a terminal phase maneuver, a depressed trajectory dive that shifted its re-entry angle outside the pre-computed engagement envelope of the SM-3s that had been assigned to it. The maneuver bought the missile approximately 40 seconds of unprosecuted flight. 40 seconds in the terminal phase of a maneuvering ballistic missile is not long. It was sufficient to generate the specific quality of silence in the Combat Information Center of the destroyer that had the intercept assignment. The silence of a crew watching a threat track accelerate toward its terminal solution, while their system recalculates the engagement geometry, and the interval between the recalculation completing and the window closing is not something that the mathematics resolves in a comfortable direction. The SM-3 that finally intercepted the 4th missile did so at a range that the destroyer's air warfare coordinator would describe in the post-engagement debrief with the flat, precise language of a professional who does not use dramatic vocabulary for dramatic situations. Close. The intercept was within the inner defense boundary. The debris field from the warhead was distributed across open ocean. No vessels were struck. The Combat Information Center did not exhale until the debris track disappeared from the display. The post-strike assessment of the underground production network began within hours of the engagement, conducted by a combination of satellite imagery of the surface subsidence patterns, seismic characterization of the underground detonation sequence, and signals intelligence analysis of the post-strike communications environment. The assessment required 72 hours to reach its final conclusions, which were transmitted to CENTCOM, to the Joint Chiefs, and to the National Security Council in a document that carried a classification level that will not be reproduced here. The unclassified summary acknowledged 3 findings. The first was that the strike had produced confirmed structural damage to the network's deep production chambers at a level consistent with mission completion against the primary aim points. The second was that the northern corridor section had sustained progressive collapse across a length sufficient to disrupt the network's internal movement capability and prevent reconstitution of production in the western section without major reconstruction. The third finding was that the network's communications had gone silent at 2:15 a.m. and had not resumed, which the assessment characterized as consistent with either the destruction of the communications infrastructure or the neutralization of the personnel operating it, or both. The assessment did not speculate about which. The intelligence staff at CENTCOM estimated, based on the geophysical survey's characterization of the network's capacity and the production rates documented by signals intelligence collection over the preceding 18 months, that the strike had set back Iran's Shahab and Kheibar Shekan production capability by a period they assessed, with moderate confidence, at between 18 months and 3 years. The confidence interval was wide because the assessment was working backward from structural damage to production impact, and the relationship between those 2 variables depended on factors: the survival of technical personnel, the preservation of design documentation, the availability of replacement equipment from external sources, that the strike had affected but not definitively resolved. What the assessment could characterize with higher confidence was the immediate operational impact. The missiles that the network would have produced in the months following the strike would not be produced. The launchers that would have been loaded would not be loaded. The salvos that would have been fired had not been fired and would not be fired from weapons that did not exist. The mobile launcher south of Tehran that had fired the retaliatory salvo was located by ISR assets at 2:41 a.m., 22 minutes after its launch. It was stationary. It had not moved after the launch, which was inconsistent with the established pattern of Iranian mobile launcher operations, and which the intelligence staff assessed as indicating either a failure of the crew's post-launch procedure or damage to the launcher's mobility system. An Israeli Air Force strike package reached it at 3:07 a.m. The launcher was a total loss of asset. The B-2 element landed at its staging location before dawn. The crew of the lead aircraft, the pilots whose aircraft had carried the first 3 weapons released against the network's deepest chamber, filed their post-mission report at 4:31 a.m. The report was technical, precise, and 11 pages long. Its final notation confirmed mission completion against all assigned aim points and noted 0 evidence of detection during ingress or egress. The city, above the network, continued its night in the particular state of a civilian population that has spent 14 days learning to distinguish between the sound of outgoing missiles and the sound of incoming ones, between the detonations that mean someone else is being struck and the detonations that mean the ground beneath them is moving. On the night of March 13th, the ground beneath the southern industrial district of Tehran moved. The residents of those districts felt it as a tremor. Brief, unusual, deep in a way that surface impacts are not, the kind of vibration that travels through bedrock rather than air. By morning, the surface above the network showed the subtle subsidence patterns that underground collapse produces in the road surfaces and building foundations above it. Cracks in the pavement, slight depressions in the ground that had not been there the night before, the physical record of something very large ceasing to exist in the space below. The arsenal of the revolution had taken 11 years to build. The targeting team had taken 22 months to find it. The strike package had taken 8 minutes to execute. The ground above it settled into its new configuration, and the city moved around it. And the weapons that would have been produced in the chambers beneath the southern industrial district remained unmade, which is a different kind of victory than the kind that announces itself. Quieter, slower, legible only to the people who understand what the silence beneath the city means. The deepest victories do not shake the surface. They change what the surface is built on.